Thank you. The lecture today that I want to present focuses on change in the contemporary international order, the role of the United States, but in the background, the role of the United Nations and global civil society. Now, what is most striking about world politics today really is the fact that we seem to be entering a period of global change, a moment when the basic rules and institutions of the international system seem to be up for grabs. Indeed, it's possible to think of the current moment as a moment not unlike the great moments after world wars, when the rules and institutions were thrown into question and the rules in the settlement process were put back together. 1815, 1945 were all moments like that. So in many ways we're at that kind of moment. The Cold War is over. The threats and challenges to global security are new, as I will try to argue. New countries and regions are being drawn into the system. Globalization is creating a kind of deep force for change, throwing things up, changing things, bringing societies together in new ways. And America's own global position in many ways is also changing. Both it's become more powerful, as I will talk about, but it's also become more controversial. And in many ways, today America has to think how it wants to use that power to create a new world order. So it does look like a turning point. Henry Kissinger, that great old American diplomat, said recently that he had never seen the world in such a state of flux, so much as he has today, when all the rules and institutions are up for grabs under transition. So it's that kind of moment of change that I want to talk about today. What is creating it? What is the crisis that comes with it? And what can we do about it? And how can the UN and global civil society play a role? I want to make three arguments as we go forward here. Number one, I want to argue that there are basic forces of change that are creating this historical turning point, that are undermining the old 1945 world order that we associate with the great system of the last 50, 60 years, the alliance system that the U.S. Developed with Europe and with Asia, the United Nations itself, and of course the multilateral institutions that were created to manage the international economy. Those are in many ways in transition or eroding or being undermined by these forces. This decline in the old order is driven by shifts of power, new types of threats, the bubbling up of new global aspirations, including global civil society. And I want to try to specify those forces of change that are bringing us to this special moment. Secondly, I want to talk about the crisis of global governance. I want to talk about the political problems that these forces of change are creating, where we do have a crisis of governance, a crisis that can be defined as a growing demand for institutions of cooperation, mechanisms to collectively tackle the great issues of our day. There's a vast growth in the demand for governance, but there is a decline in the provision of that governance, partly because of the United States, but I'm going to say it's even more complicated than that. But together, the growing gap between what people want and what people are provided is creating a crisis of governance. And finally, I want to, at the end of my lecture today, I want to say a few words about how the U.S. and its partners can take steps to rethink and reinvent the global order. What can be done? What are the pathways forward? And in my view, global civil society and new regions and peoples will be drawn into this process of inventing world order in a way that wasn't the case at the last juncture, 1945, or the juncture before that, 1919, or the juncture before that, 1815. So it is a kind of more global moment of transition. In the past, it has been a few states, a few diplomats around a single table. Today, it's the whole world. And I want to say that I'm not in a position, nor really is anyone, to give a full specification of what's coming, what that New World Order really will look like. No one knows. It is being born. It is in process. But we do know, I think, and this is what I will end my talk on today later, namely that we know what it won't be. And what it won't be is either the classical balance of power system where the order is built around a set of great powers who are balancing each other, engaged in great power rivalry, a kind of equilibrium of power that creates stability. That isn't possible really in the current democratic age and the era of American preeminence. Nor will it be an empire or rule from the top, as in many ways the argument that is made about the Bush administration and the return to a kind of neoconservative imperial project for America. That won't work either. So neither of those classic forms of international order are really going to be viable. So we are left with what is the third option? And that is a challenge for all of us to imagine. It's not easy to say what that would be, but it will clearly involve a mix of democracy, institutions, transparency, rule of law, and what I will call a kind of multilateralism, that is to say, kind of layers of multilateral institutions that will be part of the New World Order. So let me start with a discussion of the forces of change, and here I will talk about 5 of them. And all of them are collectively undermining the old order, creating challenges for the old order. The first of these 5 challenges is the decline of old threats. Really, this is most manifest in Europe. With the end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union disappeared. The Soviet Union, which was the main galvanizer of a collective will across the democratic world, across the free world, is gone. And so too, therefore, one of the major sources of cohesion, or glue, if you will, that bound these democracies together. So the end of the Cold War, the decline of the old threats that were around for 50 years, really has, of course, now been 15 years in the making. That is to say, we are 15 years away from the end of the Cold War, but in many ways that absence of that threat is continuing to kind of make itself known. And of course, there are specific questions that are thrown up by the end of the Cold War. What will be the future of NATO? What will be the future of the alliances in East Asia, the bilateral alliances? How do we rethink the coherence of this free world system? How do we think about our basic identities when we're no longer held together by being commonly against an external threat? All of this is making it more difficult to work together, to cooperate, to see ourselves as involved in a single project. And the question I would pose behind all of that requires smart people to think long and hard about the world order of the future without this basic old threat, is when all the threats disappear of this sort, and when the rival global ideologies that go with them fall away, as they did with the end of the Soviet Union and communism, before that fascism, what will happen in the absence of those global ideologies? What will be the basis for holding the global democratic world together? Big issue. That's the first big force of change that has ended and created new uncertainties. The second change is what I would call the rise of new threats. This was revealed all too painfully for the United States on September 11th. What is the new threat, the new type of threat? Well, it's these non-state groups or gangs, really, of people who threaten to acquire violence capability and unleash it on civilization. You might call this the privatization of war, and this is new and it's revolutionary. The world has never really seen it before. Previously, only a few states could acquire violence technologies that were of sufficient magnitude to inflict that force on the outside world. It would require big governments undertaking massive mobilization projects. Now we have the prospect looking forward of a few individuals who are not governments, scattered around the world in places we don't really know and can't really identify, who would be or are able to acquire violence capability to destroy cities, to kill hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps millions. This is a new and disturbing reality. Fewer and fewer people can acquire greater and greater violence capability, and we don't know what to do about it. It's rattling the world. Robert Cooper, the British diplomat, in a book that he wrote recently, said that the number of people who committed the violence of 9/11 constituted 0.0000016% of humankind. A tiny number of people, dozens, not even hundreds really, were behind that. It will only get worse, and the technologies they will have will be much more frightening, not just driving airplanes into buildings, but biological, chemical, and perhaps even nuclear capabilities. So this is something that is a problem that will never really go away. It will require us to rethink the global order, how we cooperate, how we monitor, how we enforce, how we sanction, and how we think about territory and people and political upheaval that generates the kind of hatred behind this kind of violence. But the implication of this privatization of war needs to be reflected upon, and it's something that, because it's so new and revolutionary, we're really only beginning to kind of scratch the surface and see what's going on here and what it all means. But the implication is that new threats increasingly come from societies, not from states. The individuals who are behind international terrorism, who would seek to acquire violence capability from states, are private transnational groups. They exist in societies. They themselves are not states. And this is new and it's disturbing. Robert Wright, the journalist, captures the new reality. In his words, in the modern world, intense hatreds are self-organizing and self-empowering. Information technologies make it easy for hateful people to coalesce and execute attacks. And these same technologies can also help spread hatred. That's why opponents of the Iraq War so feared its effects on Muslim sentiment. The key here, as Robert Wright says, quote, all the technological trends that are making hatred more lethal. Let me repeat that. Making hatred more lethal, not just in communications, but in biotechnology and other realms, will continue for the long time. A sound strategy for fighting terrorism in this environment will require extreme creativity. So this is new. The increasing lethality of hatred, even if we think that there aren't any more people around the world that are hateful and vengeful and who would like to inflict harm on others, if that hasn't really increased, even if it's decreased, all you need to remember to make you worry is that those few individuals, rising, declining, or otherwise, increasingly in the future will have, if they are determined and capable, at their disposal, pathogens, technologies that can kill innocent civilians on a large scale. What are the implications of this privatization of war and the rise of society-driven threats? Number one, it's less detectable. It's easier. These people and their technologies are more easily hidden transnationally and embedded in Western societies. They aren't just in the Middle East. They can be anywhere. The terrorists behind 9/11 lived in Europe. They were not even originally from the Middle East. Secondly, groups are not deterrable. They either are willing to die for their cause, they're suicide violence peddlers, or they are not detectable. They don't have a home address. You don't know where to go after them. They don't occupy a state. They are mobile. So they are less deterrable. They either are willing to die for the cause or they can't be seen. Thirdly, they have non-traditional motives that are less understandable to us. We understood Hitler. We understood perhaps the Japanese imperial army. We understood the Soviet Union, the great power wielders of the past who sought to extend their power across territory, were in some sense remarkably straightforward given the comparison with today's violence peddlers. They are not as easily to understand, those who are suicide bombers and international terrorists. New motivations, not just political but religious, civilizational hatred, and therefore less able to be bargained with. And so all of this is pointing a very disturbing picture of the problem of terrorism and the privatization of war. One final point about this, in reference really to my own government's war on terrorism, which has taken this insight and gone beyond really what many other people would think in terms of organizing American national security around going after terrorists, fighting the war on terrorism. My concluding point on this is that this problem and this way of approaching the problem is probably in the end misguided. This for two reasons. Number one, terrorism itself is a tool. It's not the threat. The threat is not terrorism. The threat is what is behind it. To say that terrorism is the threat is like President Roosevelt in World War II saying that it's the blitzkrieg that is the threat. We launch a war on the German blitzkrieg, but it wasn't the blitzkrieg. That was a technology. It was behind it was Germany, and behind it was Hitler. Behind it was a political idea. So too with the current threat of violence. It's not the violence tool. It's the political, social, ideological, religious groupings that are behind it. To talk about a war on terrorism in many ways is to forget to ask the more important question, which is, why is it happening? What are the sources of this type of violence? That I'm not going to go into in any detail today, but I'm simply saying that when we ask about the implications of the privatization of war and what we can do about it, we need to ask what are the wielders of this violence capability really interested in? What are their motives? Who are they? What do they want? Behind every terrorist is a political problem, and we need to focus on the problem, not just the tool. The third force that is altering the global order is what I call the rise of American unipolarity, the rise of America as the single superpower. No state has ever been so powerful. It is remarkable, isn't it, that a country with 5% of the world's population is spending about 50% of the world's expenditures on military power. For the first time in the modern era, a single state is able to operate on the global stage without counterbalancing alliances. The U.S. military power is what makes it unipolar. It's extraordinary in many, many ways. The U.S. began the decade of the 1990s as the only superpower, and it had the best decade of any of the great powers. Between 1990, for example, and 1998, the U.S. grew 27%, Europe grew 6%, and Japan grew 7%. So it was continuing to increase its power relative to the other countries. The Soviet Union became Russia. Russia collapsed and had an economy the size of Denmark. And China, while large and growing, is still a developing country. So the military dominance is quite striking. This new reality of American power has unsettled the world. It has made the United States more of a worry to countries everywhere. It is partly behind the anti-Americanism of today. It is creating uncertainty about the rules of the game of the international system. It's making it interesting and even possible for countries as far away as Germany Spain, Brazil, and Korea to incorporate resistance to or standing up to America as part of presidential campaigns. So the politics of American power is what I am suggesting is in play here in a new way. The end of the Cold War eliminated the other great power. The other major countries that had been so-called great powers have been weakened in Europe and Japan and Asia. And so America looks more powerful. It's the largest state on the block. And the people, as I said, are worrying. Indeed, much of the world worries about a transformation in the international order from a hegemonic order where the U.S. plays a benign role as a kind of liberal provider of liberal order built around multilateralism, alliances, strategic restraint, cooperative security institutions, to hegemonic order organized around imperial power, that is to say, power built around unilateralism, coercive domination, reduced commitment to the rules of the game. The result appears to be a growing rift even between the United States and many of its closest partners in Western Europe, for example, Korea, other countries around the world. Between the U.S. and Europe, there seems to be a basic difference between a European commitment to liberal multilateralism, rule of law, the United Nations, and the U.S., which seems to be moving away from it, seeking greater autonomy, trying to unilaterally get what it wants. But it's even more of a profound transformation than that, I would argue. It's not simply the U.S. getting more powerful. It's in many ways a transformation in the basic logic of the international order. And let me just say a word about this. I want to try to make a big, sweeping argument. For many, many centuries, the global system has been built on what I would call the Westphalian logic. The Westphalian logic. That is to say, a logic built around two elements. Number one, at the international level, an international order and a peaceful order built on the diffusion and equilibrium of power. That is to say, having multiple great powers. In the modern era, Germany, France, Britain, the U.S., Japan, China, Russia. In an earlier era, Prussia, Austria, different great powers, Spain even in an earlier era, but that there would be a global order of a kind of balancing among the major states. And at the second level, below that international level, states themselves were sovereign, hard states, what the German sociologist Max Weber described as states that have a sovereignty based on the monopoly on the use of violence within their own societies, hard-shelled states. So you had these two elements of the Westphalian order. In many ways, we now have an inversion of that order, a Westphalian flip. I know it sounds like an Olympic diving routine, a Westphalian flip. That's my way of summarizing this transformation, this inversion of the system. Now it looks upside down. The U.S. seems to have a monopoly on the use of force at the international level, and this is the important point. State sovereignty is increasingly contingent, increasingly open to international scrutiny. That is to say, U.S. scrutiny, because it's the one country with the use of force option. So in many ways, states are not billiard balls anymore, but eggs. Eggs that can be cracked, eggs that can be cooked, eggs that can be broken open by the international community. And this is creating this great instability in the international system. The Westphalian flip, countries less protected by their own sovereignty, countries less protected by a distribution and equilibrium of power. The contingency of the sovereignty is driven by a whole set of developments, really beginning with the United Nations itself and the Universal Declaration Eleanor Roosevelt, the whole post-war a consensus that the world itself needs to care more and more about what goes on within these societies. Human rights matter. If countries abuse their own citizens, it's our responsibility to do something about it. So sovereignty becomes more contingent. And then you add the privatization of war that I was just describing. Yet another reason to make sovereignty contingent, because now we care more and more what goes on within societies, not simply for human rights reasons, but also for national security reasons. If a failed state, a weak state, a state that is not fully capable of enforcing its borders or enforcing rule within its borders exists, then we worry about it, because it may well be a country that will provide a site for international terrorism. So we have these converging trends that are making everything difficult. Westphalian flip, it's a little bit like a town that for all these centuries was a town organized around multiple neighborhoods, each having its own police district, its own neighborhood watch, its own security forces. A town that then overnight turns into a town that has a single sheriff and no locks on the doors. People who own their homes do not know whether that sheriff will come in or not. That sheriff is not elected. That sheriff is not scrutinized by a community council. There's no election, no accountability. But that sheriff is saying to the world, and to the community in this case, trust me, I will protect you. And I will, because of the new types of threats and the new norms of our community about human rights, I am able to go into any house at any time without knocking and do what I want. And if there is a potential crime that will be committed, I can arrest the person before the crime is committed. We call that preemption. And I can take my my sheriff weapons and destroy the house even before the individual inside of it commits a crime. That's called preventive war. So there's something new here. If world politics is like a town with a single sheriff and no locks on the door, that is a very unstable order. That is an order that is going to continue to generate instability, insecurity, protest, and that's the world we live in. Finally, a fifth change in the system is the rise of religious and Islamic extremism. This is also very potentially far-reaching in its significance. We tend to think about it as the United States is engaged in a struggle with Islamic extremists in the Middle East. In some ways that is part of what's going on, but it's a deeper struggle in many ways, not necessarily a clash of civilizations, but a clash of philosophies about how to build international order. To the extent religious extremism becomes a kind of guiding force for states, it poses a profound challenge to the Westphalian system in a way that's different from what I've just described. It's not the sheriff with no locks. It's really a whole new set of logic for many actors within that town. It questions the basic premises on which the old global order that we have been living in for 50, 60 years is based on. A vision really of modernization, universal values, a future in which America's project and the global project are together. With the rise of religious extremism, we find a deeper challenge to that system, a system defined by, in various ways, rationality, secularism, constitutionalism, liberalism, integration, universality. Those are the building blocks philosophically, politically, for the brilliantly successful world order that we've had for 50, 60 years. The question I'm posing with this fifth and final force for change is how far-reaching is the movement away from this Western secular modernist vision around the world? Only time will tell, but it's clearly percolating up in a way that is forcing us to rethink the basic order. Now, I want to move on and just summarize this point about forces for change by saying in the background, pushing and pulling and integrating these dynamic forces is globalization, revolution in technology, in communication, in transportation, in computers, creating forces for integration of markets, societies, and people. We have discovered really globalization in the 1990s, and in the current century we've discovered that globalization is double-edged. Yes, as we thought in the 90s, it's good. It creates forces for growth and prosperity, but it also creates the seeds for resentment, alienation, the ability to project violence, as I suggested earlier. So globalization itself is creating all sorts of dynamics that are both good and bad, stabilizing and destabilizing. In the long run, globalization's most profound impact is probably the creation of what we began thinking about at the start of this lecture, global civil society, manifest by the proliferation of NGOs, cosmopolitan sentiments and identities, new realms of transnational social political space, above, below, and beyond the state. In my view, global civil society's greatest impact will be in shaping the standards of legitimacy of this new world order. Now, let me turn to my second argument for the day. And that is that those changes that I've just discussed are creating, at the level of politics among nations, a crisis of governance. In the 1970s, there was a big debate in the advanced industrial countries about whether the kind of socioeconomic changes could be governed and coped with by modern governments. And we called it the crisis of governability. In many ways today, the crisis of governability has gone global. It's really not in states, but it's between them. It's striking, if you look around the world at the multiple international institutions, they all seem to have been weakened. They seem to be less than what they used to be. They seem to be newly problematic. They seem to be in a moment of questioning, a moment of disarray. They are becoming weaker. And that is something that is partly produced by these forces of change that I've talked about, but it's pushing forward this historical transition to a new world order. Look at the institutions. Start with the United Nations. The United Nations, in September of 2005, had a global summit in which it was going to create a set of reforms in the United Nations that would turn the United Nations into a new organization that would make it relevant for the 21st century. Well, the summit came and went, and it didn't really work. There wasn't enough critical goodwill and compromise among the parties to engage in what has been described as the big bargain or the grand bargain between the developed countries who wanted the third world to take seriously its war on terrorism, to take seriously its agenda for cooperation on the new security threats, in return for those countries, Europe, the United States, and others, to take seriously the security concerns of the developing world, with population, environment, development. So there was the making really for a global bargain, but it couldn't be reached. Nor did the UN summit give us a new consensus on when and how to use force. The role of the Security Council, getting a kind of philosophy of how and when it would be appropriate and legitimate for the major countries to use force. And this then was a failure, not allowing for a way of turning the United Nations and the Security Council into the chief vehicle for deliberating on when and how to use force. So the United Nations, still an important organization, great future. If it didn't exist, we need to invent it. It does more, as I will say in a minute, than we often appreciate, but the United Nations has not been able to move to the next level, to become a central vehicle for the new world order. The European Union, look at it. It provides governance for a huge amount of humanity, both inside of the EU and on the borders of the EU, where it has been playing a constructive, integrative role. Before the EU recently was the question of a constitution. It was the moment when Europe was going to step forward and become something more than an amalgam of nation states, but to become a kind of integrated federal state that would allow it to play a global role. Well, the referendums on the Constitution in France and in Holland failed, and now that whole pathway of European growth and integration towards a federal, single, unitary Europe has really been ended for good. It's now Europe entering a new era of uncertainty, self-reflection, drift even, that weakens it as a global institution. A third institution, NATO. NATO was the hallmark, really, of Western security. It's still there. The U.S. still has troops in Europe. There's still a joint command. It still is playing a role, even out of areas such as in Afghanistan. But NATO is no longer a central vehicle for the debate and cooperation between Europe and the United States on security affairs. It's lost its momentum. Some people would say it's over with. There, in my view, is an important future for NATO, as for the EU, as for the UN, but it's weakened. It's at a moment of crisis. The G7, G8 summit, this is another feature of global governance. In this survey of all the different mechanisms around the world, you have to stop for a moment and pause and think about the G8 summit. It began in the 1970s as a vehicle for managing economic affairs among the advanced industrial countries. But it's never really provided that critical mechanism for cooperation and the generation of collective management of problems. It's been more of a photo opportunity, a way for leaders to go to a venue and see each other and exchange ideas, provide evidence of leadership back home, but in the end not really grasping the issue of how to govern and steer the global system. So it too is weak and has really, in the end, always been weak. The WTO, my last global institution, this in many ways has been the most successful in the world economy area, creating rules for trade, creating a kind of stable, open system. It's been remarkably successful, but it too, in many ways, is reaching a kind of middle-aged sense of a weakness decline, arguably. In the case of the WTO, it's the failure really to, at the multilateral international level, provide the kind of framework that will be able to tackle the new issues, environment, labor, and of course to even sustain the current attempt to push forward a new trade round, the so-called Doha round. So the WTO is also, in some sense, becoming less rather than more relevant in providing global stability and order. For all these various reasons, we have a governance crisis. One final institution I want to mention is the non-proliferation regime and other treaty-based arms control agreements. Most people outside of Washington think the non-proliferation treaty is in crisis. The bargains have broken down. This is the treaty second only to the United Nations Charter in the number of states that have signed it, well over 160. The NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, There's a bargain that has been embedded in this treaty since the 1970s when it was signed, namely that the existing nuclear powers, those countries that have atomic energy and have nuclear weapons, would agree to do a number of things. Number one, they would agree to negotiate among themselves to try to reduce their nuclear stockpile. And number two, they would, in their search in their attempt to make it attractive for other countries not to acquire nuclear weapons, they said that they would not ever use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. And in return, those non-nuclear states that signed the treaty would get access to atomic energy for civilian electrical and other purposes of power generation, but would not go into the business of trying to use their civilian nuclear programs and turn them into weapons programs. We are on the verge of a whole new era of proliferation when countries, North Korea, Iran, other countries, Egypt, are if the right, or if in many ways the wrong security environment were to emerge, we will see the world in a much more worrisome state with the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And the only thing stopping it is the NPT. And the NPT is breaking down for various reasons, but including for reasons that come from Washington, the United States not being as vigorous, if you will, in enforcing the bargains and paying attention to the kind of unraveling dynamics that are afoot. So we've got a crisis of governance, and I want to simply say that there are lots of reasons why we seem to be at this juncture of crisis. The underlying forces I've talked about, but also the problems that come from trying to build international governance. Governance means building authority and rules at the international level, creating realms of competence, institutions above the nation state. This is not easy. Democracies often want to resist it because in many ways the countries that are democracies want to be able to have the ability of their own people, who are in the end the sovereign holders of sovereignty in their countries, to have the right to decide their own fate. They resist the transfer of sovereignty away from the democratic institution to non-democratic international organizations. So there is an underlying deep problematic issue embedded in generating and sustaining global governance. And so the European Union and the constitutional crisis is in part a crisis of how you build authority upwards into the international system, in the case of Europe, in the regional system, and not lose the democratic norms, the accountability norms that we hold so near and dear within our democracies. There are also, of course, other kinds of forces at work that are making governance crisis more profound. Another of those forces really is, in some sense, the functional crises that we are facing as citizens of the world. Let me just mention two. One is in the economic area. The WTO was so successful, and its predecessor, the GATT system, over the decades because the challenge for global openness, economic openness, was really tariff reduction. And that allowed for a multilateral structure to be built for reciprocal actions that would reduce tariffs. Today, the obstacles to openness are more profound and deeply embedded in societies. Health regulations, government procurement codes. They are really obstacles to trade that were not created as obstacles, but that are inherent in the structures and rules of countries. And those to be harmonized and to be reduced require much more intensive negotiation, which does not lend itself to big multilateral fora. So part of the crisis of global governance is that the very problems that we associate with, in this case, economic openness, are ones that big global structures cannot cope with very well. The other example of the functional changes that are making governance more problematic is in the security area, and these are the problems of weapons. The WMD problem, the weapons of mass destruction problem that I've talked about in several parts of my lecture today, these are threats that in many ways are mostly felt as threats when those weapons are in the hands of governments that are not considered to be open, democratic, and fully accountable to the rule of law and to their own people. We distinguish between good states and bad states in many ways, and we worry about those that are closed, autocratic, hostile to the outside world. Those countries, when they have within their system WMD, we worry more about it than if countries that are more predictable, accountable, rule-based have those weapons. But that kind of distinction creates problems for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, when the NPT is based on treaty-based negotiations where all states in some sense are equal. So when we introduce distinctions, we make these kind of arms control agreements more difficult, and we start to move towards how can we change bad regimes into good ones. It takes the agenda for solving the problem outside of the governance system and into these more controversial realms of preemption, sanctions, unilateralism. Finally, having talked about the forces for change and talked about the crisis of global governance, how it's manifest and perhaps why it's manifest, what can we do to reinvent the global order? I've talked more about the problems and the solutions, and the overall tone of my lecture today has been rather bleak. It's not been a happy, optimistic discussion. Indeed, it's not going to be easy to create new rules and institutions. The old moments of change, 1648, 1713, 1815, 1919, 1945, were all much easier in some sense, simply because what needed to be done and who needed to do it was easier to identify and execute. Today, it's going to be more difficult because you have more people, more issues, more difficulties in thinking about what the mechanisms and what the solutions are. I would simply end by saying we need to work in a very determined way at many different levels, that short of a crisis that breaks the system into something that is not recognizable, a financial crisis or massive terrorism that turns everything upside down, we're going to have to work with what we have and start working at multiple levels. At the United Nations, I've talked about the crisis and the inability of the summit to make the grand bargain. You've got to keep working at it. You've got to find ways for the United Nations to become more relevant, building on all the great things it actually does today. Peacekeeping, peacemaking, conflict prevention capabilities. The UN is much better than its reputation would suggest. A new study by 5 governments led by Canada entitled Human Security Report 2005, Human Security Report 2005, is a remarkable document that has been issued in the summer of 2005. It's the most comprehensive survey of all the trends in global violence, civil wars, genocide, violence against women, wars, general wars, battle deaths. It has all the data on violence. And it has a remarkable conclusion that there's been a general decline since the end of the Cold War in those numbers of wars, in those numbers of genocides, those numbers of civil wars, those number of successionist struggles. There have been more resolutions of crises. then the outbreak of new crises. This is all positive. The other argument in the Human Security Report 2005 is that a lot of that can be explained by the revolution, really, an explosion in the UN's role in peacekeeping, peace-building, conflict resolution, deploying forces under the banner of the United Nations around the world, providing new solutions to old problems. Finally, in other venues where we can help build a new world order, I would simply say, go back to the G8 summit. Expand it, make it more of a global structure by bringing in China, India, Brazil. Create a new G20 of democracies led by perhaps the big democracies, but also the emerging democracies, Korea, Poland, South Africa, Canada, Chile. Broaden the democratic community's role in providing global governance. Turn the six-party talks, if they ever come to a successful resolution over North Korea, even if they don't, make them a five-party talks, keep the North Koreans out of it, and start to build a permanent security structure in Northeast Asia. There are many other proposals on the table, but the general idea is clear: to work at all levels, regional, global, security, economic, political, keep the UN focused in it, and keep making the case, and this is really my final point, making the case to the powerful countries of the world that they too have an interest in building an international order that is legitimate and widely acceptable, that they are powerful, but they too have an interest in a global order after the crisis, after the revolution, after the breakdown, a global order that is legitimate, based on the rule of law, and that is making the gap between the problems and therefore the demand for cooperation and the supply of cooperation much more congruent. Right now the gap is getting bigger, and that creates dangers. We are at a moment in history where it matters to be talking about solutions, to be talking about institutions, to be thinking of creatively, even kind of outrageously about what could be done, because a moment will come when ideas that are on the shelf will be needed, and when leaders of powerful and not so powerful countries are looking for new ways to solve problems. And that is the way, in incremental and unexpected ways, the New World Order will come into being. And with that, I want to thank you for your patience in listening to my lecture today. Thank you.